Okay, so we're back to talking about FrameNet and what FrameNet is and what FrameNet does. FrameNet is a lexicon building effort. We study words or lexical units, which I'll define in a bit. We describe the frames or conceptual structures which underlie those words. We examine sentences that contain the words from the British National Corpus, from newswires, and from the American National Corpus. We record the ways in which information from the associated words are expressed in the sentences that we examine. Here I have given you some information about the different corpora that we've used. For the most part, FrameNet uses the British National Corpus, which is a corpus of 100 million words. The corpus includes samples of written and spoken language from a range of sources. I should add that it's 90% written and 10% spoken. For the most part, not exclusively, but for the most part, FrameNet annotation is on written English, not spoken. For certain frames, obviously, you would want examples of spoken language, but for a variety of reasons having to do with the differences between spoken and written, again, it was easier to make the decision to work on spoken than to have to take into consideration all of the unique characteristics of spoken language compared with written language, right? So if you think about it, people write incomplete sentences, or at least they're supposed to. It's unusual for people to speak incomplete sentences unless, of course, they're reading a prepared manuscript, or unless they've practiced so many times that they've heard themselves speak and they know that they didn't finish a sentence, so they make themselves finish the sentence. But in ordinary, everyday conversation, most of the time we don't speak in full sentences. We used the British National Corpus mostly because in 1997, when FrameNet began, we didn't have an American National Corpus. Currently, there is an American National Corpus project underway. At the moment, that project has about 22 million words of American English, but as you see, that's far less than the British National Corpus. One of the reasons it's so difficult to develop a corpus is because you have to get permission from authors to use their work. And at least in the US, getting permission is very difficult. It involves authors and publishers and trademark and copyright, and so it takes a long time. But nevertheless, we have that project underway. It's not a project that FrameNet is spearheading. However, FrameNet is involved in certain aspects of the project. And if we have time later on in the week, I could tell you about some of the one aspect of the American National Corpus that FrameNet is involved in. We also had access to articles from the Wall Street Journal corpus. The Wall Street Journal is a daily newspaper, primarily focused on business, finance, and economic news, but not exclusively. So we did some annotation of articles from the Wall Street Journal. But day to day, mostly the data we look at is from the British National Corpus. Now I'm going to define lexical unit. The lexical unit is the focus of FrameNet work, right? We look at words, we define them, we look for examples of them, we define the frames that underlie them. And FrameNet has adopted the following definition of a lexical unit: a pairing between a lemma and a frame. And I think the best way to explain what that is to give you an example or a set of examples. So take the lemma hot. Occurring in isolation, we don't know which hot we mean. Obviously, the context might help us determine which sense of the word hot you mean, but without the context, we don't know. So I've given you examples of 3 different senses, 3 different meanings of the word hot. The sentence, "It's hot outside today," is using hot in the sense of ambient temperature. Were it hot in this room, I might take my sweater off and say it's hot. We have another use of the word hot in English, as in the curry is really hot. Curry being a type of food evokes what we might call the spiciness frame. So we're talking about how hot the food tastes. Then we have, she's one hot lady, in the sense of desirable. She's really good looking, she's sexy, she's attractive. And so you see here that hot can be used in many different contexts and actually carries different meanings. So the lemma hot, when paired with the frame, constitutes what we call a lexical unit, which again is the focus of FrameNet analysis. This brings up the topic of polysemy. Obviously an important topic in semantics and lexical semantics also. So the word polysemy literally means many meanings, right? It comes from the Greek. We use the term polysemy in linguistics for any word, any word, let's just say word in quotation marks, if it has at least more than one meaning. So as I indicated yesterday, polysemy is the core of what semantic analysis is about. I enjoy referring to the work of Stephen Ullman, a linguist who wrote a book called Semantics in the mid-1950s who said polysemy is the pivot of semantic analysis. which could, of course, be FrameNet's tagline, right? It isn't, but it could be. So lexical units, defined as a pairing between a lemma and a frame, are how FrameNet handles polysemy. We deal with one sense of one word at a time. Obviously, we deal with the entire frame, but you can only be working on one word, one LU at a time. I like to talk about word meaning in frame semantics in the following way. A frame semantic description of a lexical item identifies the frames that underlie a given meaning and specifies the way in which frame elements and constellations of frame elements are realized in structures headed by the word. Notice here that I didn't say predicate, I didn't say verb or noun or adjective or preposition, any word, right? So, as I suggested earlier, a preposition can be the head of a structure in which the preposition occurs. A prepositional phrase is one such structure. This is my first use of the expression constellations of frame elements, and I think of it as providing a good mnemonic for what valence is. A valence description is not just a description of the structures that surround the word that's the focus of consideration. It's the sum total of all possibilities of such structures. And I have some examples that we can look at later on. So constellation for me, in my mind, it brings up the idea of stars in the sky, right? So you look up in the sky and you see groups of stars together, and that's a constellation. So if you hold that image in mind, that will help you understand valence, because we're talking about the groups of things that surround the target, not just one occurrence of those things. Frame element, as we started talking about yesterday, is a frame-specific semantic role, the linguistic realization of which highlights different participants and props of a frame. So we started talking about frame elements yesterday, and the definition that I just gave you is a more focused definition that captures how FrameNet thinks of frame elements. I'm just moving ahead in my slides. Let's look at the next example. So consider the communication frame, an example of which is Charlie told Joe that Mike was late. Another example, Charlie told Mike about his lateness. So we have a speaker, an addressee, Charlie being the speaker and Joe being the addressee. And we can either have a message or a topic. Notice that, could you go back to the previous one? Notice that you couldn't have both in a single sentence, right? It would have to be one or the other. And I bring this up here because a little further down the line, when I get into some of the more technical aspects of how FrameNet uses frame elements, how FrameNet defines frame elements for a specific frame, this matters. That you have different argument structure, possibilities, right? Either a that clause or an about clause, but you couldn't have them together. So this is an example of why I talk about valence in terms of a constellation. It's not one or the other, it's both, but not both at the same time. However, we need to know that both possibilities exist. Let's go ahead now. Okay, so FrameNet distinguishes core and non-core frame elements. A core frame element is one which uniquely defines the frame. In the communication frame, whether or not the speaker, the addressee, the message, or the topic are instantiated in a sentence, we know that these roles are there. We know that these concepts, I should say, are there, right? So if I were to say, if I were to be speaking with Tiago, I could say, talk to Maria, right? So there's no speaker mentioned there, but the structure of the sentence and the context in which it's said makes it clear that there's a speaker involved. So even if there's no linguistic instantiation of a particular core frame element, it's core because we know it's part of the situation that we've characterized. A non-core, it's more than that. It's not just part of the situation that we've characterized. It must be part of the situation that we characterize. Okay? A non-core frame element describes aspects of events more generally, or situations more generally. Some examples are time, place, direction, duration, right? As I said earlier, an event occurs at a time and in a place, whether or not we talk about that time and place, right? A non-core frame element will give you more information about that event or situation or object, but you don't need it there to define the situation. It's a very important distinction. So until now, when I've talked about frame elements, I've only talked about the semantic role and possible names for the semantic role given a particular frame. In fact, a frame element is a triple of information. It's the semantic role, it's the grammatical function of the constituent that that semantic role labels, or that frame element labels, and it includes information about the phrase type. So we could say then that the term frame element is polysemous, right? It names the semantic role as well as the semantic role and the grammatical and phrase type information that comes with it. Like a lot of words, the category, the name of the category and the contents of the category. A very common kind of polysemy. But it's important to remember, and you'll see this when we start looking at FrameNet annotation, that we're not simply talking about the semantic role. And it's particularly important because we'll see that semantic roles, the same semantic role can come along with a different grammatical function or a different phrase type, right? Depending on how the sentence has been constructed. And I think that was, that information was central to the early work, well, certainly in case grammar. It didn't matter what position it had in the sentence. It didn't matter whether it was a noun phrase or a prepositional phrase. That linguistic material still carried the information of the semantic role that it filled. So let's look at another frame. Let's look at this lexical unit avoid in the avoiding frame. Here are some examples. We must avoid jumping to conclusions. Victoria avoids weekend work. They could not avoid criticism. Young people can avoid getting into trouble. Can anyone tell me what's unique, what they see in these sentences? Now, I know not everybody knows English well enough to really say anything, but I think the syntax in the sentences is pretty clear. So maybe somebody can tell me how they might group. Which two sentences would you group together? Which sentences would you group together? No,
it's unfair.
No, I'm not calling on you. Yes, 1 and 4. Excellent. Why would you group them together? I can't hear you. Right. Right. Excellent. So she noticed that the first sentence and the fourth sentence both have an ing verb phrase as a complement or as completing the sentence, right? And the other two just have noun phrases, right? What I'm getting at, what I hope you're beginning to see here is the beginning of what a valence description for the verb avoid would be. And we have to include all possibilities. Remember the constellation. Okay? So we might define the avoiding frame in the following way. An agent avoids an undesirable situation under certain circumstances where that situation can be an event or an activity. And our core frame elements, that is, the frame elements that uniquely define the frame, are agent, the person who avoids the undesirable situation, and the undesirable situation, that is, the situation that the agent avoids. Let's look at some annotated examples. Right now, annotated only for frame element. So the examples that we started with, in the first one, the agent is we, and the undesirable situation is jumping to conclusions. In the third sentence, they is the agent, and criticism is the undesirable situation. So the point here is to notice that the undesirable situation is a role that must be filled, and it can be filled in more than one way in terms of the syntax of the linguistic material that instantiates that role. Non-core frame elements in this frame are conditions, so the conditions under which the undesirable situation is avoided. Manner, the manner in which the agent avoids the undesirable situation. And means, the means by which an agent avoids that undesirable situation. Earlier, someone asked me about adverbs, whether we work on adverbs. The non-core frame element manner is often used on adverbs. So that isn't an example of an adverb as a target, which is also possible, but that is an example of adverbs under consideration. We know that they're there. What I have pictured here for you is a valence table of the verb avoid in the avoiding frame. Notice that I've only included the core frame elements. Also because they're the core ones and they're the ones we know that must be there. So I want to look at an example or two of how those manifest linguistically. And I'm going to look at an example a little later on of the two types that we talked about. One where the unavoidable situation is just a noun phrase, and one where it's an ing verb phrase. So here are important things to know about valence. Valence includes the kinds of phrases that can go, for example, with a verb to make a complete predicate. I used the verb example earlier, so I'm talking about verbs here. That's a general way to talk about valence. If I'm thinking about the semantic description, or the semantic part of the valence description, I want to know about the roles that the situation requires and that the predicate evokes. So in avoiding, the verb avoid requires an agent and an undesirable situation. In terms of the syntax, it's the set of syntactic patterns in which each word functions to express the frame, right? So in our example, we had different syntactic patterns. We had a noun phrase, and we had an ing verb phrase. We often talk about valence or combinatorial possibilities, which is, by the way, a very Fillmorian expression. As far as I know, he made it up. I'm not even sure that combinatorial is an official word in English, but certainly at FrameNet we use it all the time. So you can think of combinatorial possibilities as meaning, form, and function mappings. Remember the triple of information? The frame element, the semantic role, the grammatical function, and the phrase type. All those things are mapped together to give you the constellation of possibilities. Frame element, phrase type, grammatical function. We happen to talk about it in a different order. Frame element, grammatical function, and phrase type, but you know, there's no reason why. We definitely have frame element as primary and the other information with it, but there's no a priori reason to talk about it in one order or the other. Okay. So to review, valence is the semantico-syntactic combinatorial possibilities, meaning, form, function, mappings, and FrameNet valence descriptions include information about frame element, phrase type, and grammatical function. Okay? So now let's look a little more closely at different phrase type and grammatical functions. Our example with the ing verb phrase type is instantiated here with a few more sentences. The art loss register carefully avoids probing into the subject matter. So the colored font shows us the different frame elements, and each of these sentences shows a verb phrase ing phrase type whose grammatical function FrameNet calls dependent. Tomorrow, I think, I talk about the different phrase types and grammatical functions that FrameNet uses, and in particular, what's important now is, the only thing that you need to know now is that FrameNet, for a variety of reasons, FrameNet uses a limited set of grammatical functions, and we'll talk about that a little more tomorrow or the next day. So here are these examples. And I haven't indicated on this slide the phrase types of some of the other frame elements, but for example, the manner frame element instantiated with the word carefully, we would call that an adverb phrase, right? And the phrase when she asked, which instantiates the condition frame element, is a type of when statement, or when sentence, I think we call it. Okay, so now we're going to start looking at the process of defining frames, creating, defining frame elements, and searching through a corpus to get ideas of what the semantic roles, what those frame elements are going to be for a particular situation, for a particular frame that we're in the process of characterizing. So we are talking about the attaching frame. Which is the frame that you started reading about in the reading assignment for today. Obviously, I'm not going to go into all of the detail in the article, but I did want to go through the higher level issues that come up and have the opportunity to answer questions that you may have from your reading, and remind you that you're still reading that article for tomorrow. It's a long, dense, somewhat dense article. Dense in the sense that there's a lot of material. I hope it's not dense in the sense of difficult to read. I want to point out at the start that while it may seem that there's a straightforward, step-by-step linear process in defining a frame, making lists of words that we believe are likely lexical units in that frame, defining frame elements, and so on and so forth. In everyday practice, there are many things going on at the same time. We could be examining the corpus, or a number of FrameNet lexicographers can be examining a corpus. And then they come across some data that suggests, uh-oh, we need to step back and rethink whether or not we've actually captured the situation sufficiently or appropriately. Maybe we missed a frame element that the data now suggests that we need. Or maybe in the course of examining the corpus, I come across some LU, some lexical unit, a word that I think ought to be in this frame, but some data suggests that either it belongs to some other frame that we have not yet defined, or it's polysemous, so it's in this frame and it could be in another frame. So there are many things going on at once. Sometimes we go back and then we go forward and then we move on and then we change our minds. That's in, as I'm sure you all know, that's in the nature of conducting research in general. And that's in the nature of trying to analyze based on data rather than assuming a certain set of criteria and looking for data that fit. So FrameNet's approach, FrameNet's philosophy and practice in day-to-day is bottom-up. We look at the data. What do the data tell us? How do we need to adjust our analysis so that it captures the data? Okay, so earlier we talked about having an informal definition of a frame. This is actually the formal definition. Formal in the sense of this is the definition that's in FrameNet. Okay? Informally, we might think about attaching as someone attaches something to something else. And maybe they use some rope-like thing to do the attaching, right? So this is how FrameNet has defined the attaching frame. An agent attaches an item to a landmark by manipulating a connector such that the item is fixed to the landmark, or an agent attaches two items to each other where each serves as the landmark for the other. This asymmetric or symmetric relationship profiles the parts and has them remain as parts without creating a new entity, right? So I can tie the horse to the flagpole with a rope, or I could tie my hands together, right? So the asymmetric and the symmetric. The parts are still obvious, but it's a difference of granularity. No, it's not granularity. It's symmetry. They're either symmetric or asymmetric. Okay. So the frame elements are agent, connector, handle, item or items. Item would be he tied the horse to the flagpole. Items would be he tied my hands together. No, that's wrong. My hands were tied together, right? So hands tied together. He tied my hands together. Items, right? The items are tied together. Landmark is the flagpole. And result would be something like together, right? Okay. So now let's look at an actual annotation. If I'm not mistaken, this is an actual FrameNet annotated example. Then Sapt tied the rope around one of the trees near the water. So Sapt is a person, the agent. Our target is tie in the attaching frame. The rope is the item. And round one of the trees near the water is the landmark. Unless you've had the opportunity to look at FrameNet data on the web, you might not know that we annotate frame elements on sentences so that when they're viewed, you see the extent of the frame element on the sentence, right? We talked about this earlier. It's not just the noun, it's the whole constituent. So the question is, how did I get those nicely labeled colored sentences? in talking about the FrameNet process, I have to first say that FrameNet takes the encoding view of language. That is, given a situation, what forms, lexical material, grammatical constructions, does a language have to describe it? Okay, so what's the frame? What are the ways that the language provides to talk about the situation characterized by that frame? So, the FrameNet process. First, informal characterization of the frame. Examples of which we've talked about yesterday and today. For this frame, somebody attaches one thing to another thing using some kind of connector, or someone joins two things together. Notice that when we characterize frames informally, we're not yet worried about what names we're going to give to the frame elements, right? This speaks to your question earlier, what should I call this? Of course, when we start this process, the person or people working together to define a frame may already have some idea of what that frame might be, right? And again, to illustrate the not necessarily linear ordering of steps in the process, although we talk about frame definition, although we talk about our work as first characterizing the frame, in fact, sometimes someone is interested in a particular word or set of words, and they begin by listing semantically similar words. And they use that as the point of departure to define the frame informally, right? You can actually start either way, starting with the name, starting with the concept. And I think either way or both ways are useful. That is, I don't think you only have to start one way or the other way. I think it's fine to do some one way and some the other way. You know, your brain works in different ways, and you might as well take advantage of that to do FrameNet type analysis. Okay, the next thing we do, which I've hinted at, is collect words of similar meanings. And the similarity is a result of the words built on the same semantic frame, right? So you may be looking at, you may start out with words and think of words that are semantically similar, and then in the process of grouping and sorting the words, you come to understand that one word you had in there maybe really goes with a different frame, right? So it's not wasted work, because in principle, we want to define all words in the language. We want to characterize all frames. It may be a lifelong endeavor, but that's the goal. Okay, so let's assume we started with an informal characterization of the frame, of the attaching frame, and then we start collecting words. And in our list of words are attach, bind, connect, fasten, etc., as well as tie, the word that I highlighted in our initial. In the next step, we pick one of the basic words from the list and build concordances for the word. So that requires going to a corpus and manipulating the corpus so that you get examples of the word that's under consideration. FrameNet has used XQuick, which is a corpus search tool. XQuick was made available to us by the University of Stuttgart, and we've used it to build concordances for the word. FrameNet uses other analogous search tools as well, some of which are web-based. But the goal, regardless of what interface we use, is to get a sense of the syntactic context in which the word under consideration occurs, as well as get an idea of what semantic roles need to be filled for that word, along with what types of entities will fill those roles. The last thing I mentioned is important also because to some extent that helps us choose a name for the frame element, right? So if I look at a corpus and discover that in a simple active sentence with my verb as the target, the subject is always a human being, then I'm more likely to name the frame element agent than something else, right? And keep in mind that when FrameNet uses the frame element name agent, yes, of course, it's similar to agent as in, as was used back in 1968 in the case, but remember, we're now looking at things differently. We're not looking at the roles, we're looking at the situation. So sometimes we give very, very specific frame element names to the roles because it tells us something about the frame. It also tells us something about the frame. We'll come to some examples of that. Okay, so this is what the results of an XQuick search look like. The lemma that we're looking at, remember, is tie. Can you guys see this? Not so much. Let's see.
If you turn on the lights, then they won't see you. Turn off.
Can we turn off the lights briefly and focus on the screen rather than me? Because this is important. Okay, so you see that in this picture, the lemma tie with the part of speech as a verb, which you can request when you're using a corpus. You can look for different lemmas, different parts of speech. You can sort to the right, you can sort to the left to get a sense of what are the arguments or what are the frame elements for that word. And if you look at the corpus using what we call the keyword and context view, right? So you have your target lemma at the center, and you can scan the screen and see what kinds of syntactic structures you may have just after the word or just before the word. That will help figure out what the participants and props of the frame are, and it will also help figure out what the syntactic structures surrounding the target are. And that's important because in the FrameNet process, after you get a sense of what things actually are by looking for the, by searching the corpus, you then have to go and pull sentences from the corpus, because only when they're pulled from the corpus and imported into the FrameNet software can they be annotated in frame semantic terms. Okay, and I have some pictures of that later on. I think now's a good time for a 5-minute break.
Ok.
We're going to take a 5-minute break.
Só 5 minutinhos, só para quem quiser ir ao banheiro.
So